Hi, I'm glad you stopped by. In Luke 19:13, Christ tells us to occupy till I come. Well, what does this mean? How are we to live when all this stuff is happening around us and we're supposed to occupy till I come? What is it that we're supposed to do? Well, Matthew 24 gives us some important information that is extremely pertinent to this very day. And we're going to take a look at what James White has to say in his explanation of Matthew chapter 24. And we're going to do that right now. This is James White's exposition of Matthew 24. And this just means it's an explanation. Starting in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, we have wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes have occurred at different periods since these words were spoken. Therefore, these, as they have ever existed, cannot be regarded as the especial signs of the end. It may be urged, however, with a good degree of consistency that the Scriptures teach that these calamities would exist in the last days to that extent as to constitute a sign of the approaching judgment. We wish to keep the important fact distinctly before the mind that the sacred Scriptures do teach when men may not and when they may look for the second appearing of Jesus Christ. Now we're going to skip across the page over here on the right side, starting with the word he. He does not intimate that his people during these long periods may expect the end. No, not once. But when he comes near our time, the Lord gives signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and adds, "When ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." Now, it's important that we point out at this point that it has been 175 years since we reached the time of the end. And those signs in the sun, moon, and the stars have already been given. And we're going to address this a little bit more in just a second. Mark this, our Lord does not mention wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes as signs of his second advent, but rather as events of common occurrence all the way through the Christian age, which must exist before the end. And that's an important point. This is a common event that we are looking at here. The plague that stalks the land today has given numbers that speak volumes that we need to address, and that's what I'm going to be doing right here in just a minute. So now we want to take a look at testimonies number 16, and at the bottom of this other page is the word "the" up here in the upper right-hand corner, and then we're going to be reading a little bit here. The Lord intimates a delay before the morning finally dawns. He would not have them give way, that's his people, to weariness, nor relax their earnest watchfulness, because the morning does not open upon them as soon as they expected. The waiting ones were represented to me as looking upward. They were encouraging one another, repeating these words, "The first and second watches are past. We are in the third watch, waiting and watching for the Master's return. There remains but a little period of watching now. I saw some becoming weary. Their eyes were directed downward, and they were engrossed with earthly things, and were unfaithful in watching. They were saying, in the first watch, we expected our master, but were disappointed. We thought surely he would come in the second watch, but that passed, and he came not. We may be again disappointed. We need not be so particular. He may not come in the following watch. We are in the third watch, and now we think it best to lay up our treasure on the earth, that we may be secure against want. Many were sleeping, stupefied with the cares of this life, allured by the deceitfulness of riches from their waiting, watching position. And now we're skipping up here to the top on the right. Starts out, I saw that it was impossible to have the affections and interests engrossed in worldly cares, increasing their possessions, laying up treasures upon earth, and yet be in a waiting, watching position, as our Savior has commanded. Said the angel, they can secure but one world. In order to acquire the heavenly treasure, they must sacrifice the earthly. They cannot have both worlds. I saw how necessary was a continuance of faithfulness in watching to escape the delusive snares of Satan. Now, this is a very important point here. This begins to give some important information about what it means to be in a waiting, watching period. And that watching is defined in this sentence as to escape the delusive snares of Satan. I encourage you to do a little research in the Authentic Spirit of Prophecy with that word watching or watch. So now I want to take a look here at God's original plan for man. And that is that we should be farmers. That was the work he gave to Adam. And this is the natural order for man. Adam was a farmer. For about the first 100 years of America's history, most people were farmers. In Ecclesiastes 5:9, we are told, the king himself is served by the field. And this is true. Here is the formula. You plant in the spring. You grow in the summer. You harvest in the fall. And then you prepare for winter to plant in the spring. And God has a promise found in Genesis 8:22. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So in the harvest, people gather their food. That's what harvest is all about. And they gather it up, and then what do? They store it. And this man here with his tomatoes is putting his tomatoes in a bed of straw so that he can store them and they won't be damaged. So there's important point here is no one knows the future. But we know that in a farmer's lifestyle, they run through this planting in the spring, growing through the summer, and harvesting in the fall, and storing for the winter. and they store up enough food to last 1 year. And maybe a little more, but generally it's a year-long event, because what you're wanting to do is have something to eat all year long. Remember, in the first 100 years of America's history, most people were farmers. And there was not grocery stores like we have today. That's considered to be artificial, although it is the way we live. So the important point here is to store up some food. Be like the farmers so that you don't have to go to the store every week. So we have this thing coming. It is a pandemic. And if you see a tree in your backyard and the tree is leaning way to the south, I mean, it's not standing straight up. It's seriously leaning. And you can see the roots starting to come out of the ground. It doesn't take much thought to consider that if that tree falls, it's going to fall to the south because it's leaning to the south. And that's a very important thing. Now we're going to take a look at a chart here. This chart is deaths over time. I'm going to enlarge it here a little bit. This is deaths over time. And this chart was made on Thursday, 2 days ago. And down here, in the yellow, well, first of all, in the green, we have deaths from SARS. And you can see that growth curve for that. Then you have the swine flu deaths from 2009 and how that goes. And then you have down here this, in the yellow, down here, the coronavirus deaths. This is the tree leaning to the south, and it's going to fall to the south, barring intervention by God. We do not know what God is going to allow and how much. The key point here is be prepared. If this pandemic goes the way that it's already, we already have 2 more days stacked on top of this, and this curve is not getting flatter. It's heading up in the same direction that it's going. And what that means is the possibility exists that 100 million people in the world could die. This is already in 20 countries. And the world population right now, however, is 7.7 billion people. And if we lost 100 million people to this disease, then we would have 7.6 billion people in the world. And it would be a terrible disaster. But look at it in the big picture. There's a lot of things to consider. But for you, if you get quarantined for 2 weeks, you're going to need food for 2 weeks. And that's what this key point is about. Get prepared a little bit. You don't have to go crazy, but be smart about it. Search the net for more information on this subject than you can ever consume. And at the least, you should have enough food in your home for 2 to 3 weeks. Get a small box and put your food in it. Start with some rice and beans or whatever you want. This food should all be able to be stored dry. Add a few canned goods. Keep it simple. Get things you like to eat. Don't get something you don't like, because it'll drive you crazy. All right. What has already started is not one of the 7 last plagues, but it is a pandemic, and you need to get prepared for it. Remember what James White said in Matthew 24. This is just a common occurrence. That's what Christ is pointing out. Well, what about us? Well, you are the apple of God's eye, and He has His eyes on you. However, out of this crisis could come the test of the mark of the beast, which is Sunday. If this happens, it will be the end of the waiting, watching time, and the loud cry will immediately begin sounding. And everyone needs to be prepared or preparing for this event, as we do expect it to happen soon, pandemic or not. Now that's a key point, because the signs in the sun, moon, and the stars have been fulfilled. We are in the patient, waiting, watching time. Christ can come at any time. We look forward to and have the faith in the immediate second coming of Christ. Jeremiah 29:7 tells us what we need to do. Seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof ye shall have peace. And this is a key point also. The wicked have no understanding how much they owe their peace, safety, and security in all departments to the Christians living in their midst, because the Christians are doing what God has told them to do, and that is pray for the peace of the city. Now we're going to cover some important information from a document that you may have never heard of before. And this document is called the 1849 Broadside. That was the first publication of this information, and we're going to read a couple paragraphs here. For 2 years past, I'm right here up here at the top. For 2 years past, the Lord has shown me in vision repeatedly that it is contrary to the Bible to make any provision for our temporal wants in the time of trouble. Now we're going to pause here for a second, and I have to tell you, since October 22, 1844, we have been in the little time of trouble, or the short time of trouble. And it's only called a time of trouble. The time of trouble in the future is called the time of trouble that never was, since there was a nation. That is also called the time of Jacob's trouble. And it is the time of Jacob's trouble that this is speaking about. To repeat, for 2 years past, the Lord has showed me in vision repeatedly that it is contrary to the Bible to make any provision for our temporal wants in the time of trouble. I saw that if the saints have food laid up by them or in the fields in the time of trouble, when sword, famine, and pestilence are in the land, it will be taken from them by violent hands, and strangers would reap their fields. Then will be the time for us to trust wholly in God, and He will sustain us. I saw that our bread and water would be sure at that time, and we should not lack or suffer hunger. Now that's important to know. Don't try to prepare for the time of Jacob's trouble. But now, in this little time of trouble that has lasted 175 years, we are to prepare. It's just like harvesting in the fall, you prepare for the winter. A time of winter is coming, winter of this pestilence, right? Winter's a time when you can't grow food. If you are in quarantine, you cannot grow food. You cannot go out of your house. And in Wuhan, in China, they were boarding people up inside of their apartments so that they could not get out. Okay. Continuing. Then in a time of need, correction here. I'm going to back up a little bit. The Lord has shown me that some of his children would fear when they see the price of food rising, and they would buy food and lay it by for the time of trouble. Then, in a time of need, I saw them go to their food and look at it, and it had bred worms and was full of living creatures and not fit for use. About 1 week since, the Lord showed me in vision that houses and lands would be of no use in the time of trouble, and in that time they could not be disposed of. That's because in that time of trouble is when there's not going to be any buying or selling for those that don't have the mark. Okay, continuing. I saw it was the will of God that the saints should cut loose from every encumbrance, dispose of their houses and lands before the time of trouble comes, and make a covenant with God by sacrifice. Now, these next couple sentences are going to be very important. I saw they would sell if they laid their property on the altar and earnestly inquired for duty. Then God will teach them when to dispose of these things. Then they will be free in the time of trouble and have no clogs to weigh them down. This next paragraph. I saw if they held on to their property and did not inquire duty of the Lord, he would not make duty known, and they would be permitted to keep their property, and then in the time of trouble, their property would come up before them like a mountain to crush them. Then they tried to get rid of it, but could not. I heard them mourn like this. The cause was languishing. God's people were suffering for truth, and we made no effort to supply the lack. And now our property is useless. Oh, that we had let it go and laid up treasure in heaven. I saw a sacrifice did not increase but decrease and was consumed. I also saw, now this is a key point here, I also saw that God had not required all of his people to dispose of their property at the same time, but in a time of need, he would teach them, if they desired to be taught, when to sell and how much to sell. I saw that some had been required to dispose of their property in past time to sustain the Advent cause, while he permitted others to keep theirs until a time of need. Then, as the cause needs it, their duty is to sell. Okay, there's more to this, but this is the key points. Number one, you need to be prepared now in this small time of trouble. Number two, you need to not prepare for the time of Jacob's trouble after the close of probation, because God is going to feed us, and we will not be suffering hunger or thirst, because there's not going to be any water to drink for the wicked. They're going to have blood to drink. Okay. And we are to keep our property on the altar so that it will sell in God's providence, and in His timing He will teach us what to do and when to do it. Okay. Is this the end? No one knows the future except God. You need to be ready for the end of your personal probation. And we have this now from a Review and Herald, May the 6th, 1862. This is about perfection, and this is about preparing for translation. It is constantly an onward march. Jesus sits as a refiner and purifier of His people, and when His image is reflected in them perfectly, they are perfect and holy and prepared for translation. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. There is a place in the 1858 Great Controversy where it proves that the people waiting for Christ to come, October 22, 1844, it says that they reflected Christ's image. Now you think about that. What does that mean? That means they were perfect and holy and prepared for translation. That's what that means. I was shocked when I read that. Continuing here, it says, a great work is required of the Christian. We are exhorted to cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Here we see where the great labor rests. There is a constant work for the Christian. Every branch in the parent vine must derive life and strength from that vine in order to yield fruit. This is breathtaking because it is amazingly laid out here how you can be perfect, but you still are having to battle with Satan. That's the constant work that's going on. But you will not know that you are perfect. You are only going to know that you are doing all in your power, and then Christ's righteousness covers you. That's a beautiful thing. Now, if you want a copy of the 1871, Matthew 24, send me an email and ask me for it. Also, the 1849 broadside has a great deal of information in that, and you can include that in the email, and I'll be glad to send that to you. This is Sunday, approximately 1 p.m., and we're going to do a little update here on this particular topic. And right here where my mouse is, put a little circle on it there. Putting the coronavirus in context of the deadly SARS epidemic, the coronavirus pandemic has now officially exceeded SARS in cumulative cases in just 2 weeks. And we'll take a look here at this chart where it's a little larger, and I'll put a link in the description for these items. This is the case number on this red line. Now we're going to talk about something else. This is the Lancet. You will hear people talk about the Lancet study or the Lancet report or whatever. This is a very professional thing that is done here, and we're going to focus on this is the summary, and you can download it right up here in the corner up there, and I'll have you a link for this in the description. I recommend you download it, read it, and inform yourself. So by January the 2nd, this is exactly 1 month ago, 30 days ago, 41 patients were admitted to the hospital and it was confirmed they were infected. This is the first cases that were reported and they were studied. So this is the study, the summary of the study and what went on. We're going to focus here on the part that I am highlighting, a little short sentence, and it says 13 or 32% of the patients were admitted to an intensive care unit and 6 died. And then it says 15%. It's important to understand that 15%, that 6 is 15% of the total of the 41 that were admitted. This is not 15% of 13 that were admitted to an ICU. This is 15% of 41 that were admitted. What does this mean? It means that 15% or 15 people out of every 100 will die. It means 15,000 out of every 100,000 will die. So the United States has a population of 330 million people. That's a rounded off number. And you can make that calculation yourself. I highly recommend that you get a little bit prepared. Study Psalms 91, because most people, there's going to be a lot of interesting things happening in the next few days. We also have a report that on this page, I'll put a link in the description also for this. And so the United States has, let's see, I have to scroll down here. You can read this stuff for yourself. Trump has declared a public health emergency in the United States. Now, that's important to understand. Also, notice that an entire school district in the state of Ohio was completely shut down on Thursday and Friday after nearly 600 students called in sick. So we don't know exactly what happened there, but probably the parents had a meeting and decided it was stupid to just keep going to school and crowding all these different people together. But we don't know that for a fact. I don't have any facts. You can read this article for yourself. Get informed and do not depend on the mainstream media. That's an important point to understand. All right? And make sure that you get right with God, because if you're one of the 15% and this pandemic actually comes into this country in a big way, that will be very important that you are prepared. And we've already talked about that. On this is a Google search page, not exactly Google, it's DuckDuckGo. And I searched on the average number of hospital beds available per 1,000 people. And you can look on here, find your country. I used nationmaster.com, and you bring this up and it will list your country, whatever it is, and show you the approximate number of beds per 1,000 people. It gets very interesting because the conditions, if the infection rate holds, the conditions in hospitals will become just as crowded as it is in China. And that's important to pay attention to. All right? We will see you in the next video. God bless your study.